It all started on a cold, rainy Tuesday morning, one of those mornings when the sky hangs so low it feels like it's sitting right on top of your shoulders. And by the time I pulled my old Ford through the gate of my storage lot, I knew something wasn't right because there was a tractor-trailer parked exactly where no truck had any business being. Two men wearing bright orange safety vests were already unloading massive steel I-beams, each one longer than my pickup, stacking them in neat rows like they'd done it 100 times before. I slammed on my brakes, jumped out before the engine even stopped running, and yelled, "Hey, you're on private property." One of the workers barely looked up. He shrugged, pointed toward the cab, and said, "You'll have to talk to the developer, buddy. We were told this was the drop location." Before I could say another word, the driver climbed back inside, released the brakes, and that truck rolled away, leaving behind several tons of steel sitting on land that had belonged to my family for more than 30 years. I just stood there listening to the rain tapping against the beams, trying to convince myself this had to be some kind of mistake, because surely nobody with millions of dollars tied up in a construction project would be careless enough to dump expensive material on somebody else's property. My name is Daniel Carter, and that little gravel lot outside the town of Riverton wasn't some investment property I'd forgotten about. My father bought it back in the late 80s after spending nearly 20 years working double shifts at a paper mill, saving every dollar he could. After he passed away, I promised myself I'd never sell it. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't worth a fortune, but every fence post and every patch of gravel reminded me of weekends spent fixing old trucks beside my dad. People don't always understand that land can carry memories heavier than money ever could. That's why seeing those steel beams sitting there felt less like someone borrowed my property and more like someone walked into my living room wearing muddy boots without even knocking. Once I got home, I found the company name printed on one of the shipping labels and called immediately. A woman answered with the kind of polished corporate voice that somehow sounds friendly while saying absolutely nothing. I explained the situation, gave her my parcel number, described exactly where the steel had been unloaded, and waited for her to apologize. Instead, she paused for a second and casually said, "That should only be temporary storage for one of our upcoming mixed-use developments. Someone will take care of it soon." I remember tightening my grip on the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. "Temporary?" I asked. "Ma'am, you're talking about my land, not a public parking lot." Another pause. Then, "We'll look into it," followed immediately by the click of the call ending. I stared at my phone wondering if that conversation had actually happened. The next morning, the steel was still there. So was the next morning, and the one after that. Rainwater collected beneath the beams, leaving rusty streaks running across the gravel like dried blood. Every time I drove past the lot, my stomach tightened a little more. My neighbor Frank, who'd lived across the road longer than I had, leaned against his mailbox one afternoon and shook his head. "You gonna let them get away with that?" he asked. I laughed, but it wasn't because anything was funny. "I'm trying to do this the right way." Frank smirked. "Companies like that count on folks doing things the right way because they think you'll eventually give up." His words stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit. Still, I wasn't about to lose my temper. I mailed a certified notice demanding they remove every piece of steel immediately. I paid extra for proof of delivery because something in my gut told me I'd need every piece of paper before this was over. A week passed. Nothing. Another notice went out. Silence. Then a third. By then, almost 5 weeks had gone by. And every afternoon, I found myself sitting in my truck staring at those beams, wondering if they honestly believed they could occupy someone else's property forever simply because they were bigger, richer, and surrounded by expensive lawyers. What they didn't know was that I had stopped asking when they planned to solve the problem and started asking what the law said happened when they refused to. That single question would change everything, because buried inside a county ordinance I had never heard of before was one paragraph that made my heart start beating faster than it had in years. And the moment I finished reading it, I realized the people who thought they had all the power had just made the biggest mistake of their entire project. I must have read that ordinance 20 times before I believed what I was looking at. Every sentence seemed too good to be true. So I printed it, highlighted it, then drove down to the county records office just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding some legal language hidden between the lines. The woman behind the counter looked over the document, smiled politely, and said, "It doesn't happen often, but yes, if every required notice has been properly delivered and the statutory waiting period expires without the owner reclaiming the property, there is a legal process for transferring abandoned property rights." She wasn't giving me legal advice. and she made that crystal clear. But she didn't need to. She had already confirmed the one thing I needed to know. I walked back to my truck, carrying a folder that suddenly felt a whole lot heavier than paper should. For the first time since those steel beams landed on my property, I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. That's a dangerous shift when someone underestimates you. People think patience is weakness because patience doesn't make much noise. It doesn't slam doors or threaten lawsuits. It just quietly waits until the other side makes one mistake too many. I called my longtime friend Melissa, who owned a small salvage yard about 30 miles away. We'd known each other since high school, and she had forgotten more about commercial steel than I'd ever learned. When I explained everything, she was silent for a few seconds before laughing. "Daniel, are you seriously telling me a multi-million-dollar developer dumped structural steel on your land and then ignored 3 certified notices?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," she whistled. "Either somebody in that company is incredibly arrogant or incredibly stupid." "Maybe both," I answered. Instead of celebrating too early, we agreed to document absolutely everything. Melissa even drove out the following afternoon carrying measuring equipment and a camera. We photographed every single beam from multiple angles, recorded serial numbers, documented weather conditions, estimated weight, and logged precise GPS coordinates. Frank came over carrying a cup of coffee and signed a sworn witness statement describing the original delivery because he'd watched the entire truck unload from across the road. Another neighbor confirmed the steel hadn't been touched since the day it arrived. My cousin Ethan, who worked in commercial insurance, suggested I record continuous video showing there had been no effort whatsoever to retrieve the material. Suddenly, my dining room table looked less like someone's house and more like a detective's office. Documents covered every inch of it: delivery receipts, parcel maps, certified mail confirmations, property tax records, photographs arranged in chronological order. Every night, I'd sit there with a yellow legal pad checking and rechecking dates, making sure nothing was missing. Somewhere during those evenings, I realized this wasn't really about steel anymore. It was about respect. Somewhere inside a conference room filled with polished executives and expensive architects, someone had looked at my property and decided that because I wasn't important enough, they could use it without asking. Maybe they assumed I couldn't afford an attorney. Maybe they figured I'd eventually pay to have the beams hauled away myself. Maybe they thought I'd simply accept being ignored because fighting back would cost more than surrendering. What they never considered was that ordinary people sometimes have one advantage corporations don't: time. We pay attention because we have to. Every dollar matters. Every acre matters. Every signature matters. Meanwhile, they were probably juggling dozens of projects across 3 states, convinced my little gravel lot was too insignificant to remember. The waiting period finally expired on a bright Thursday morning. I barely slept the night before. At exactly 9 o'clock, I walked into the municipal building carrying my binder. The city clerk inspected every document carefully, occasionally asking a question, occasionally flipping back several pages to verify dates. Those 20 minutes felt longer than the previous month combined. Finally, she reached for the stamp, pressed it firmly onto the final page, signed beneath it, then slid the paperwork back toward me. "Everything appears to comply with the filing requirements," she said. I thanked her, walked outside, climbed into my truck, closed the door, and just sat there smiling to myself. Nobody around me had any idea my entire situation had just changed. Legally speaking, the conversation was no longer about someone else's steel sitting on my land. It was about property that had now entered a completely different legal category. That afternoon, Melissa called asking, "Well?" I couldn't help grinning. "Let's just say we're officially moving into the next chapter." She laughed so hard I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "I knew they'd regret ignoring you." Apparently, word traveled faster than I expected because early the following morning I heard tires crunching across the gravel. A brand new black pickup stopped beside the beams. A tall man wearing polished work boots climbed out carrying the kind of confidence people usually mistake for authority. Before he even introduced himself, he barked, "I'm Jason Holloway, project manager for Summit Ridge Development. We're here to recover our steel." I leaned against my truck and calmly replied, "Morning." His eyes narrowed. "You'll need to move your vehicle." "Actually," I said, "I don't think I will." His expression shifted from annoyance to disbelief. "Excuse me, you're standing on private property." He laughed once, the kind of short, dismissive laugh people use when they think they're speaking to someone beneath them. "Sir, those beams belong to our company." I nodded. "They used to." That got his attention. What does that mean? Without saying another word, I opened my folder and handed him copies of every notice, every certified receipt, every filing, and finally, the approved abandoned property determination. He skimmed the pages, then started reading more slowly. The color gradually drained from his face. "This can't be right," he muttered. "It is. Nobody told us." "Exactly," I interrupted gently. "Nobody inside your company bothered to answer the 3 letters I sent." He looked back toward the steel, then toward me. "Look, this was obviously a misunderstanding." I almost smiled because it was the first apology anyone had attempted, except it wasn't really an apology. It was damage control. "A misunderstanding lasts a day or two," I replied. 5 weeks is a business decision. He pulled out his phone and walked several yards away. I could hear him arguing with someone, pacing back and forth, drawing frustrated glances toward me every few seconds. About 15 minutes later, he came back. His tone had completely changed. "Can we work something out?" There it was, the sentence that never would have been spoken if I backed down a month earlier. I folded my arms. "I'm listening." "We need that steel." "I know. It's already scheduled for the Riverside project." I figured. "How much do you want?" I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "I'm not interested in negotiating under pressure. If your company wanted a conversation, you had 3 certified opportunities." He rubbed both hands across his face, clearly realizing this nightmare was growing by the minute. "You're making a mistake." I shook my head. "No, Jason. Your company made one. I'm simply following the law." He left without another word, but something told me that conversation wasn't really over. It was only the beginning, because within 48 hours the phones would start ringing. Lawyers would begin asking uncomfortable questions, and I'd receive an offer so unexpected that even Melissa would stare at me speechless when she heard the number. For the next 2 days, my phone rang so often I finally switched it to silent just so I could think. Unknown numbers, corporate offices, assistants asking if I had a few minutes to discuss an ongoing matter, even a law firm that suddenly seemed very interested in hearing my side of the story. Funny how nobody had time to return my calls when I was simply asking them to remove their own property. But the moment the paperwork stopped favoring them, everybody discovered the value of communication. I answered exactly 1 call, and it wasn't from Summit Ridge Development. It was from Melissa. "You'll never guess who walked into my yard this morning," she said. "Let me guess. Somebody looking for structural steel?" She laughed. "Not just somebody. Their original supplier. Apparently they're scrambling because replacing those beams will delay the entire project." I leaned back in my chair, looking out the kitchen window toward the drizzle settling over the fields. "So what did you tell them?" "I told them I might know someone who legally owns a very familiar inventory." We both laughed, but underneath, it was something else. Relief. Weeks earlier, I'd been the guy wondering whether anyone would ever take me seriously. Now the people who had ignored me were racing the clock. In time, it quietly switched sides. Melissa handled the discussions because she knew the market far better than I did. There were no dramatic shouting matches, no revenge fantasies, no childish attempts to humiliate anyone, just numbers, paperwork, and the kind of calm professionalism I wished Summit Ridge had shown from the beginning. 3 days later, she called again. "They've agreed to buy the entire inventory." "For how much?" There was a pause just long enough to make me nervous. $14,000. I actually thought I'd misheard her. "Say that again." "14,000. Daniel, and before you ask, yes, all the documents are in order." I drove over to her yard the morning everything was finalized. One by one, the same style of flatbed trailers that had dumped those beams on my property rolled through the gate to haul them away. I couldn't help noticing the irony. The steel was leaving exactly the way it had arrived, except this time, every signature, every invoice, every transfer document carried my name instead of theirs. One of the truck drivers climbed down from his cab while the last bundle was being secured. "Crazy story," he said with a grin. "Never seen a company buy back its own steel before." I smiled. "Neither have I." As the Finey trailer disappeared down the highway, Melissa nudged my shoulder and said, "You know what the funniest part is?" "What's that?" "None of this happened because you had more money than they did." Yeah, she was right. I didn't win because I hired the biggest law firm or because I had political connections or because I knew someone important. I won because I stayed patient when it would have been easier to lose my temper, because I documented everything when it felt unnecessary, and because I respected the legal process even when the people on the other side clearly didn't. A few weeks later, I drove past the construction site that had started this whole mess. Tower cranes stood frozen against the gray sky, hardly moving. Equipment sat parked behind temporary fencing, and there weren't nearly as many workers as I'd expected. Maybe the delay was caused by the missing steel. Maybe it wasn't. Projects that size are complicated, and I honestly don't know everything that happened behind the scenes. What I do know is that small decisions have a funny way of becoming expensive lessons. If someone inside that company had made one 5-minute phone call after my first certified letter arrived, they would have recovered every single beam without losing a dime. Instead, they spent weeks pretending I didn't exist, and eventually paid far more than the cost of simply doing the right thing. Every now and then, I still drive out to that gravel lot, especially after it rains. The steel is gone now. The rust stains have faded. Fresh gravel covers the places where those heavy beams once rested, and if you didn't know the story, you'd never guess anything unusual had happened there. But I remember standing in the rain wondering whether ordinary people ever really stand a chance against companies with endless resources. I remember doubting myself, questioning whether sending another certified letter even mattered. Most of all, I remember the moment I stopped reacting emotionally and started thinking strategically. That may have been the biggest victory of all. People often ask me if I'd do anything differently, and the truth surprises them. I wouldn't. Not because I enjoyed the conflict. I didn't. Stress has a way of following you home, stealing your sleep, and making every phone call sound like bad news. But sometimes life hands you an opportunity to decide what kind of person you're going to be. When someone with more power assumes you'll simply move aside. In my case, I chose patience over panic, preparation over anger, and facts over shouting. It wasn't flashy, and it certainly wasn't fast, but in the end, it worked better than any argument ever could. Still, there's one question I've never completely answered for myself. Was it really just an honest mistake made by a careless employee? Or did someone honestly believe a regular property owner would never push back? I still don't know. And maybe I never will. That's exactly why I'd love to hear what you think. If you were in my position, would you have accepted an apology and returned the steel? Or would you have followed the law exactly as I did? At what point does a simple mistake become deliberate disrespect? Share your thoughts in the comments because stories like this rarely have only one side, and some of the best conversations happen when good people disagree respectfully. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next real-world story where patience, common sense, and the law collide in ways nobody sees coming until it's far too late.